This is Dr. Giudice from Larchmont Wellness, and today's topic is going to be called Toxins. It's one of my favorite topics to talk about, and it's timely because it's the time of year, seasonal changes and such, where it's a good time to start thinking about doing detoxes and nutritional cleansings and such. So I wanted to do this quick audio PowerPoint for you to peruse over. It's also the type of topic that does have the ability to make people depressed, so do your best to not get overwhelmed with this topic and just take action steps at the end. So, more than 50 years ago, Rachel Carson published the book Silent Spring, and it started talking about chemicals and pollutants that start to impact the ecosystem. And what she looked at is that 35 different bird species are threatened due to extinction due to toxins, namely DDT in this topic. And a recent one, a friend of mine brought this to me who lives out west, saying that she was seeing patients with all sorts of thyroid issues and such, and was having a hard time piecing together because it didn't look like your typical autoimmune thyroid cases. And running some tests, she figured out that there was acute toxic exposure in these people. And then finally was brought to the attention that the clothing that they used was actually laden with some new chemicals that were previously not in there, and it was getting people extraordinarily sick. And this is how it turned out. Everyone obviously knows that chemicals and things like that affect our system, but probably don't realize how these things start to build up in the body and can cause long-term problems, and you get more and more sensitive to things over time. For more data on environmental toxins, you can go to ewg.org or eartheasy.com. Because I don't want to dive too deep into it today, I just want to scratch the surface and get people to start thinking about it more and take some action steps, but these are some good resources. So how do chemicals affect us? There's something called toxicant-induced lack of tolerance, which causes autoimmune reactivity, and the acronym for toxicant-induced lack of tolerance is TILT. And there it is. So more and more we're starting to see things that we're witnessing another medical anomaly, a unique pattern of illness involving chemically exposed groups, more than a dozen countries who subsequently report multi-system symptoms, the new onset of chemicals, food and drug intolerances. And I put this slide in here because one of the newer phenomenon that was not present when I began practice 15 years ago or so is genetically modified organisms, which is just defined as plants or animals that have been genetically engineered with DNA from bacteria, viruses, other plants and animals. And just saying that doesn't sound right to anybody, and it's very much defended in the food industry, and the government seems to be okay with not telling us we're being exposed to genetically modified organisms, and it's defended saying that the toxins and glyphosates that are in these foods do not accumulate in humans, which research indicates is not the truth. So this is a new class of challenges that we have to work with. It's estimated that the average American consumes at this point somewhere in the neighborhood of 180 pounds of genetically modified food every single year, and that number is going up pretty dramatically. So here's our toxicant-induced lack of tolerance. Toxicant is just a more scientific word for a toxin. Has in certain cases causes these things that we could classify as autoimmune phenomenon. And in this study here, the primary toxicant insult, the individuals become sensitive to low levels of diverse and unrelated triggers to their environment and commonly encountered chemical and food antigens. So what happens is, the more and more you get exposed to this, the more sensitive you get. Kind of like if you get a bee sting the first time, you may not have a response, but that second time, if you're sensitive to it, the reaction starts to get much more dramatic. We're serving our children 31 million GMO meals per school day, which is frightening. So these kids get exposed. Once we become more sensitive, we start to lose tolerance. And as we start to lose tolerance, the immune cascade occurs, and that's when we start to have inflammatory responses, immune responses, and of course become toxic. So in this article from 2013, emerging problem with ubiquitous adverse toxicant exposures in modern society has resulted in escalating numbers of individuals developing chemical sensitivities disorder. So now we're calling it a disorder. So here's some data indicating the increase of some diseases, this namely autism, glyphosate exposure increasing, and the correlation with those numbers. So as we get into TILT, or toxicant-induced lack of tolerance, first is the loss of tolerance due to acute or chronic exposure, whether that's low level or one exposure. Second is the subsequent triggering of symptoms by extremely small quantities of previously exposures. So in this article here, which you could pull up on PubMed, chemical intolerance occurs in 1 of 5 primary care patients, yet is rarely diagnosed by busy practitioners, probably because the AMA is seemingly okay with exposure to these toxins and seems to be having some sort of remuneration from food companies, and they just simply have a lack of training on this. This is the type of thing where you need to search out. And the EPA, which should be designed to protect us, now is seemingly saying it's okay to have extreme amounts of these toxins and keeps raising the levels of which they deem to be safe. So in conclusion here, people who are not normally sensitive to chemicals can become mildly or extremely sensitive if they reach the overwhelm point. Anything like stress, exposure, illness, traumas, this can obviously put you over the edge. Environmentally chemically sensitive can be considered a possible cause of any chronic illness. So another thing that can occur is we lose integrity of our barrier systems, whether that be lung, gut, skin, or the blood-brain barrier, which should prevent toxins from getting into the brain. So we have an exposure, and this would be the intestinal wall here, and what we see is a breach of these tight junctions, and we get these toxins getting right into the bloodstream. So just some delineation between irritable bowel and leaky gut here. Some data on probiotics, that intestinal bacteria target the tight junctions, change the proteins, and it can actually open and close them, and in a sense giving themselves a key to let themselves in. There's only a few probiotic strains that can improve function, and the diet is critical here. And this is a more chemical diagram. So if we look at xenobiotic exposure, which is simply toxins, and how this process occurs. So oftentimes with an autoimmune response, we have little or no symptoms, and then by the time we get symptoms, we're already well on our way to having an autoimmune disease and tissue damage. Some data indicating that 1 in 12 women and 1 in 20 men, and I think these numbers are low, develop an inflammatory autoimmune rheumatic disease in their lifetime. And in another study, the body makes certain antibodies directed against itself years and sometimes decades before autoimmune causes. And we see this all the time, where we find somebody who may be relatively asymptomatic or symptoms not classically associated with an autoimmune disease, and we test them and it turns out they have thyroid antibodies or something of this nature. So we draw some conclusions from this data. So the best defense against this would be an active offense, and an active offense would be to actively detoxify yourself. And we obviously want to concern ourselves with a lack of exposure on a daily basis and taking some nutrients that would help us with the detoxification process. However, several times a year, I recommend twice a year. However, for more chemically sensitive, we might consider doing it with every seasonal change, some sort of active detoxification. So there's a lot of misinformation about detoxification. It's actually a fairly complicated process, and all these things that I'm going to list here go on seemingly simultaneously. So we understand that we cannot just detoxify by drinking green drinks or not having alcohol for a week. We have what's called phase 1, or the cytochrome P450 phase. We have phase 2, which is also known as sulfation conjugation. We have glucuronidation, glycine conjugation, and methylation and acetylation, as well as glutathione conjugation, which is the glutathione conjugation is extremely important. It's one of the reasons why fasting for long term isn't very helpful, because our glutathione levels start to drop as we don't have adequate amino acids and protein. So what I'm recommending at this point is what's called the easy 3-step biodetoxification. And the reason why I like this new detoxification by biotics research is because it handles not only the liver, it also handles dysbiosis in the intestines, and it's relatively inexpensive, extremely easy to follow. It lets you eat foods. We're not going to have side effects from this, healing crises and such, because the phase 1 of this is going to get the gallbladder functioning and start to handle the inflammation. And it's extremely easy to follow and lasts somewhere between 17 and 30 days. So if you have questions on this, feel free to give our office a call, 914-630-7777, or simply go to our website listed below. Thank you.